The biggest piece of news that's happened probably in the past decade was the unexpected outcome of the 2016 election. It took us from a long period in which politicians hadn't been particularly different from one another, even across party affiliations, and in a situation where we'd had one party in power for 8 years, and it looked very likely that that was going to continue for at least another 4, to one where we had a very unusual unexpected outcome of the election, and a politician who was quite different than politicians we'd had before, as well as national party in control of the House and Congress. And it was very unexpected. We can characterize investors as likely Democrats and likely Republicans depending upon the zip code in which they live. And then we can observe that households that lived in Democratic zip codes after the election tended to sell out of the stock market and move into safe assets on average, whereas households that lived in Republican zip codes tended to buy into the stock market and sell relatively safe assets to do so. So they were trading with each other differentially because they differentially updated what they thought was going to happen to the US economy and the US stock market following the election. Now, how do we know that's about beliefs, rather than simply that the fact that the new administration was going to differentially impact the economic outcomes of Democrats, likely Democrats, relative to likely Republicans? How do we also know that Democrats and Republicans aren't just different in other ways? They could be different ages, different wealth, different zip codes. And so the reason one can come back and say, well, this is probably about beliefs, are really 2 pieces of evidence. The main one is that we're going to compare very similar people. So it is true that the Republican policies, the Trump-led policies, were probably going to impact certain states and localities differently due to changes in the tax rates, like the mortgage interest rate deduction and the state and local tax deduction, and that different industries would be favored by the policies, the policy changed relative to the industries that were favored before. So what we have to do is basically compare people who are similarly treated by all of those other alternatives. So we want to control for people being similar ex ante in terms of age, income, and wealth, which we can do. And so we can compare people with similar ages, income, and wealth. We can also compare people who live in the same county, work at the same employer, and therefore are affected similarly by the local economic changes and by whatever is happening to their employer. And by looking at those types of people and finding one who lives in a Democratic zip code and one who lives in a Republican zip code, we can really tease out the likely impact of the differential way that they interpret the public event on their portfolio. And so again, the likely Democrats tend to sell equity or sell out of the stock market, while the likely Republicans tend to buy into the stock market. A second piece of evidence we can look at is actually survey reports of beliefs. We can look at the University of Michigan Survey of Consumer Sentiment. Prior to the election, stated Democrats are roughly neutral on the future performance of the US economy, where stated Republicans are somewhat pessimistic. After the election, stated Republicans moved from somewhat pessimistic to highly optimistic about the future performance of the US economy, whereas Democrats moved from roughly neutral to slightly pessimistic. That's striking fact, very clear in the data. Supportive of our interpretation then of the beliefs rather than economic impact, however, those beliefs driving the portfolio behavior we identify, rather than the local economic impact, their opinions don't change much about their own future income in a year. The national economy is supposed to do much better or much worse after the outcome of the economy. Their own economic situations, the election does not have much of an effect on. So their beliefs are, Republicans do become slightly more optimistic, Democrats slightly more pessimistic, but it's a very small movement. And so that suggests that really what happened was people had very different models of the world. Democrats believe in one set of policies are going to be effective and Republicans other. The election changed the view of the likely policy outcomes. That changed their stated beliefs about the future economic performance, and their portfolio choices followed those belief changes.